And today our guest is Dr. Christian Stokke, and we're going to be talking about consciousness development in Rastafari. Your article was excellent. How are you doing, Christian?
I'm good, thanks.
Is Rastafarianism a philosophy or a religion? And who founded the movement?
Yeah, okay. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me on your show, Lipton. And then if I can ask you a tiny question first, because I noticed you have quite a bit of Caribbean content on your channel. Do you live in Jamaica yourself?
Well, yes, I do live in Jamaica, Christian, but most of the content is actually not Caribbean. There are a few interviews with Orlando Patterson, who was born in Jamaica, and I interviewed Trevor Bernard, who's a foreigner, but he has written extensively on Jamaica, but many of the interviews are not from Jamaica.
Yeah. I just noticed the ones with Orlando Patterson. I also read of some of his things. Okay, let's get back to your question on is the Rastafari a religion or philosophy? And I think it's a really interesting question to start with. And especially since Rastafari can mean a lot of different things to different people, and the movement is also quite diverse. I did also read your article that you published just very recently on Rastafari, and I appreciate that you start with the focus on Rastafari as a liberation movement, because this was exactly where I wanted to start when you sent me this question. And we can talk about then a little bit about different dimensions of liberation, which would also cover the philosophical and the religious, and then try to come to a conclusion there. My own article, I started this also with a very profound quote from one of Bob Marley's songs, where he says, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." And I kind of feel that this captures some of the essence of the Rastafari movement. So what is mental slavery, and how would we free our minds? These are questions that are key to the Rastafari philosophy, religion, spirituality, or social movement. And we can explore a little bit the different dimensions of it. First comes let's address the political liberation aspect, which would be the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle. And this is also the origins in 1930s Jamaica during colonial rule, when Jamaica was ruled by the British, and ordinary Jamaicans experienced heavy oppression, poverty, and this is the material context. And this is where I've also noticed that you, on your channel, have interviewed some other scholars who would, on the impact of colonialism, the impact of slavery, and the post-slavery situation in the Caribbean. So I will not go deeper into that dimension, which isn't really what I have focused my own research on. The next dimension then, for me as an anthropologist, is very interesting, which is the cultural liberation aspect, which is in the academe, often discussed in post-colonial theory, the whole tradition that starts with Frantz Fanon, who also was a liberation ideologue and a psychiatrist. He was originally from the Caribbean as well, from Martinique, which still is governed by the French. And he wrote this famous book called Black Skin, White Masks, which addresses this thing of the cultural aspect of colonialism, where the dominant Western European culture is being internalized and imposed on other people around the world. So that is one aspect which Rastafari from the start was fighting against, struggling against. And this also leads on to the next one there, which Bob Marley refers to as mental slavery. And there are several other psychologists in the African American tradition who have been talking about this concept, and like it also relates to the concept of false consciousness that is sometimes used in Marxism. So the whole idea here is that a way of thinking, a cultural way of thinking that is not authentic to the people, is being imposed by another group that is more politically powerful in a relation of dominance. So I think this would also relate to Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, and he has this theory of hegemony, where there is a kind of cultural indoctrination that goes on through the media, through the education system, through churches, and so on. And I have in my article some examples of that, where it was part of the dominant ideology, of the dominant culture, that black is bad, white is good, and black Jamaicans and several of the people on the internet forum where I did some of my research also told stories about that, how people have this attitude that black is ugly and white is pretty, and so on. There are beauty standards and in many different dimensions. So this is something that fueled the Rastafari movement. So it was like an early part of this, what later became the Black consciousness, Black power movement in the US.
Yes, and its founder, Leonard Howell, was a Garveyite, although Garvey was a critic of Leonard Howell, but Leonard Howell was a Garveyite.
Yes, I wanted to come back a little bit to Marcus Garvey later, because there are some Rastafarians who consider him as a prophet, which is also kind of interesting.
But Christian, we're going to touch all of the issues that you're talking about, but we're going to do it in a systematic manner, because I have a line-by-line step to ask you the questions. And
okay.
Yes, you're giving a lecture. Yes, you will talk about all these issues, but we're going to do it in a line-by-line way. All right, then.
Okay,
so, sure. Rastafarianism. What are the mansions of Rastafarianism?
Yeah, okay. Let me talk a little bit about that. I would have to say that although in my articles I do discuss a little bit about these mansions, the organized groups in Jamaica, which would be the Nyabingi, the Bobo Shanti, the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church, the 12 tribes of Israel. There are some others, but these are some of the bigger ones. And I could say a little bit about them, but I would like to say that this is not what I have focused on in my research, because I did my research on an internet forum that is run by a group that is not based in Jamaica, but in Trinidad, and where the people are more aligned with what is today often called the spiritual but not religious section. So I could say a little bit about the differences there, because some of these organized groups in Jamaica they fit more into like the pattern of a traditional religion, where some of them have like Old Testament rules. They view Haile Selassie as God, and Marcus Garvey as a prophet, and it's like more on the level of taking the Bible literally and like reframing the interpretations into an Afrocentric view. Whereas as the forum that the people that are running this forum, that where I did most of my research, they had slightly different perspectives on that. So I don't know if you want me to
well, Christian, we're only going to Christian, we're only going to speak briefly about these groups like the Nyabingi, the Bobo Shanti, and the Ethiopian Coptic Church, because your research is about consciousness development in Rastafarianism, but background information is important. So when I ask you, I really want a brief overview of the Nyabingi, the 12 tribes, and the Ethiopian Church in Jamaica. Just a brief overview.
Okay, I will give you a very brief one. So the Nyabingi are some of the more political ones, which really see themselves as militant anti-colonial warriors. And they also follow this very, like they take the Old Testament of the Bible very seriously and have this more conservative rules and view the former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie as God. I could say something more about that symbolism a little bit later. The Bobo Shanti are more towards the religious side and less political, but they also see Marcus Garvey as a prophet. The thing with the influence of Marcus Garvey was also that it as you already said, it fueled the Black liberation movement and also the idea of repatriation to Africa, which was for a time a very dominant idea in the movement. The Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church leans more towards a spiritual side and talks more about Jesus than about Haile Selassie, and as Jesus as a living God in each person. And then the last of the four groups that I do discuss a little bit, the 12 tribes of Israel, they also started out as a more organized group, but have gradually developed in a more liberal direction, have become more similar to Christianity. And this last group is also where Bob Marley was associated with.
And in Jamaica, the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel, people consider that group to be a group of uptown Rastas. So it's quite liberal relative to other Rastafarian groups.
Yeah.
But this question is important. Our viewers would love to know the answer. And you already explored it a bit, but I'm just going to repeat it again. Haile Selassie, do all Rastafarians view him as God? Because there's this great controversy about his role in Rastafarianism.
Yeah, this is very interesting, because this is where I would like to refer to some of the people on the forum where I did my research. This is a Trinidad-based forum. It is run by something that is called the Self-Empowerment Learning Fraternity. So it is more aligned with like the contemporary spirituality. And one of the leader persons there said that Selassie was a symbolic inspiration and not necessarily a god. And that although from the 1930s and the following decades, Rastafarianism was more modeled on how traditional Christianity was, but it has gradually moved then with people getting more education, getting more different perspectives, and also moved forward more to the symbolic thing. The role of Ethiopia, I mean, there are several reasons why Ethiopia, particularly when we know, as some of the other people you've interviewed also talked about, that most of the African slaves that came to the Caribbean were from Western Africa. So why Ethiopia? One important reason is that Ethiopia is mentioned in the Bible as a powerful kingdom. And another thing is that it is one of very few countries in Africa that was never colonized, although the Italians tried around World War II, but it wasn't colonized in that same way. So that when the Rastafarians were searching for a symbol that could show that Black people could be equal to whites, or even like Black supremacy that some of the mansions talk about, having this example of a Black emperor that the Europeans had not been able to conquer, that was mentioned in the Bible also, it became a very powerful thing. And also Rastafari, the name comes from the title that Haile Selassie had as a prince before his coronation, which also happened in the 1930s. I don't know if that is.
That's sufficient. Ethiopia has a long and distinguished history as an African empire, and then prior to, well, I shouldn't say prior, but Aksum. People often write about Aksum, and Aksum is closely related to Ethiopia, Aksum and Eritrea. Well, Aksum was in that region, so people often write about Aksum and Ethiopia. Aksum as the precursor to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So the Ethiopian history is quite interesting. There have been some new books on Ethiopia in the medieval ages, but we're not going to speak about them on the show. Marijuana is also important to the religion. Do all Rastafarians smoke marijuana? You write that more spiritual than political, the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church does not believe Haile Selassie is divine. They locate Zion in Jamaica, not Ethiopia, and see Jesus as the living God embodied in all humans. They emphasize the sacredness of marijuana used during prayer.
Traditionally, I think most Rastafarians really looked at marijuana or ganja as it would be. They would call it as an important tool for meditation and for that change in consciousness. The people on that forum where I did my research, again, there were some discussions about that, and there was also a shift away from that. I mean, I could say a little bit about this, the idea with the spiritual versus the religious, if you like.
You should.
Yeah. Thank you. So what I'm using in my article is there's a distinction by a scholar of religion called Linda Woodhead, who talks about religion versus spirituality, where religion refers to the externals. For example, the Holy Scriptures, churches, organizations, authorities, hierarchies, doctrines, and rules, which are often like visible material things, whereas spirituality is then the inner dimension. And in part, it can be like the philosophical and the mind, but it is also feelings, experiences, the feelings of energy, and also at the core of Rastafarianism, there is the mystical dimension, as also Bob Marley captures in a song called Natural Mystic, where they enter this meditative state, and marijuana has been one of the ways of entering that state, but there's also other techniques like the drumming and chanting. And when you listen to reggae music, there's often this, they would ask, do you feel the vibe? And you can feel, often the music can make you feel like goosebumps and chills and get teary-eyed, and this is where we enter this mystical spiritual dimension that goes beyond like the more mental or intellectual dimension. So there's a distinction there, and one of the persons on this discussion forum, which I've also quoted, says that those who want to use the idea of a savior other than oneself as an excuse not to do the work necessary to reconcile with one's higher self can do so, but there is no shortcut around the hard work of constant character refinement and critical self-examination. So you can see there's a shift there from a model that is more like traditional Christianity, which is about salvation, waiting for the Messiah, where Haile Selassie is presented as the savior, the Messiah in a Christian model, towards an idea that is more similar also that we see in Indian spirituality and philosophy, about becoming free from the ego and working with oneself, and also this is where the psychological dimension that I focus on my article also comes in. If you would like me to continue, I have a couple of other quotes that.
Well, we're going to continue soon, but before we do so, I'm going to give some more context. So, the Bobo Shanti group is perceived as the most radical group in Rastafarianism, and you're right. The most political and orthodox are the Nyabingi. Sorry, not the Bobo Shanti. The Nyabingi group is seen as the most radical group in Rastafarianism, not Bobo Shanti. I was actually planning to talk about Bobo Shanti later.
Yeah.
The most political and orthodox are the Nyabingi, a term often translated as death to black and white oppressors. They see Haile Selassie as God and follow theocratic Old Testament rules. Members wear dreadlocks and see themselves as militant anti-colonial warriors. More religious than political, but also conservative and Afrocentric is the Bobo Shanti group. But the Nyabingi group, that's the group that's known for challenging the Babylon system. So when we talk about the liberation, roots of Rastafarianism and oppression, we are often referring to the Nyabingi because the Nyabingis are serious about dismantling the legacies of colonialism that have a negative effect on people of African descent, and Jamaicans are primarily of African descent.
Yeah.
So even today, some Rastafarians in the public space, if they're told to engage in an activity that they don't like, they will curse the Babylon system. And even if I don't agree with the response, I find the act interesting because Rastafarian. So this is the paradox in Rastafarianism. The economics of Rastafarianism is on the left. To some, it seems more socialist than capitalist, but Rastafarians are really individualistic people, as your not your interviews, as the people you studied suggest. They're really individualistic. They have an intrinsic locus of control. They're conscious. And as one lady said, it is not always about the system. Before you change the system, you have to change yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
So
would you like me to go on a little bit?
Yes, you can go on about the stages of consciousness. So you identified 3, the warrior stage, Anancy, and the lamb stage. Dennis Forsythe, you were relying on his research, yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to add a few words on Babylon also first, if I can.
Of course.
Yeah. Because it's not only the more radical groups that use Babylon, but it's a term that is, one of the key terms really in the Rastafari movement, and it's also a metaphor from the Bible, from the time when the Jews in Israel were conquered and abducted by the Babylonians, and this is a parallel to how the African people were abducted and led into slavery by Europeans. So there's an identification with the situation of the Jews, and then the European system, the Western system, is Babylon. And Babylon can be, it can be anything from, when we talked about the dimensions of liberation also, it can be anything from the system of imperialism or capitalism, but also culturally, psychologically, the way of thinking. And there are also some other terms that are used in the Rastafarian language, like they like to use wordplay. So they talk about politics and religion. So politics is tricks, so they trickery. So they say it's politics, and religion is a lie, so they call it religion. So there is this positioning there against also the whole dominant way of thinking, and I think that is where we can start speaking about consciousness raising. That is a key term that you also asked about, and one thing that I personally found one of the most profound insights in Rastafari is the way that they link political consciousness raising with spiritual consciousness raising. And also, what you mentioned with individualism is also, it is very interesting in the Rastafari philosophy, because it is in some sense left, but in other in another sense it's individualistic, and it transcends and goes beyond this whole left and right political distinction.
Yes, and the Rastafarianism can pose a cultural and social challenge to the state that is political. The challenge not the challenge, but the challenge that Rastafarianism has posed to the state is often more intellectual and ideological than political. So on the question of mental slavery, corresponds to Anancy. It's at the Anancy level, and Anancy is a spider in Afro-Jamaican culture was quite tricky and deceptive. And we read the Anancy stories because many of the slaves who went to Jamaica were from the Gold Coast. So in that region today, Ghana, the Anancy story also has some political import. And you discuss a woman called Kelani from the Congo. And she writes, many Africans are still mentally enslaved. I was one of those who hated my kinky hair and had it chemically done. Ayana from Trinidad, a core member of Self, writes, as a child growing up, I was surrounded by the feeling that lighter was better, that if the kink in my hair could relax just a teensy weeny bit, I would be more beautiful, and maybe, just maybe, people would rush to play with my hair. So these viewpoints represent people at the Anancy level who are still mentally enslaved.
What they refer to in the past, but now they have reached a level where they have reached a higher awareness.
Yes. So Kelani is no longer at that level. She has evolved, but the quotes that I refer to represents people like Kelani when they were at that level, assuming that their culture, black, is innately negative.
Yeah, and I think that the Anansi metaphor, I can also, I mean, one aspect of it in a broader sense is how when people feel powerless in a system and being oppressed, then they adapt some outward appearances that will make them accepted in a way, instead of being authentic and being themselves. And what Rastafari tries to do is to empower the individual then to be authentic and become a lion, to stand up for themselves, for what they really are, instead of just accepting what they call the false values that are being imposed from the system. And an aspect there also is this very competitive thing where, trickery that you referred to, and where people try to survive. It's really, people are in a mode of just trying to survive, so that there is not a focus on living authentically, living ethically, but just to get by. If you can get a little bit of money to have food for the day through doing some things that are unethical, then that is justified because it's a survival logic. Whereas in the next stage, then what the Rastafarians stand for is that you should become authentic and only follow the values that are right for you. And still, even though, I mean, it is individualistic, but there are also some general Rastafari, I mean, there are values, spiritual and religious values.
The warrior stage, that's quite important. And a person on the forum called Muata, his views represent someone at the warrior stage, and he writes, glorify and sanctify his imperial majesty, Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering line of the tribe of Judah. Nyabingi, Royal Imperial Patriarchal Black Supremacy, stand forever. Rastafari, bonfire, crash lightning, and thunder for Babylon, don't press her. And I have a contemporary, I shouldn't even say contemporary parallel, but a current parallel that you're going to appreciate. It was published yesterday in the Jamaica Gleaner, titled, Bobo Hill Rastas were captive in this hellhole called Jamaica. Group renews call for repatriation to Ethiopia. I don't know if they're part of the Bobo Shanties, that group that was founded by Prince Manuel, but they're the Bobo Hill Rastas from the Ethiopia Africa Black International Congress. So maybe they're not Bobo Shanti. And priest Trevor Stewart told the Gleaner, a lion born in an alligator pond is not an alligator. And this statement reflects contempt for slavery and the forced migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere, in particularly Jamaica. We were taken here forcibly in the Western Hemisphere by the Europeans and white world, and they took us here down at this hellhole called Jamaica, and we've been agitating from that time to now for a return legally compensation back to our motherland. So this occurred during our recent independence celebration. So again, the Rastas were being countercultural.
Yeah.
And the last stage is the more self-reflective stage, that of the lion. Sorry, not the lion, the lamb.
Of the lamb, yeah. There was a quote that you started reading from Ayana on this forum. If I can just go a little bit back to that, she says that we should all accept personal responsibility while challenging the system. All change must come from people from within themselves. And then this is why so many revolutions fail, because people hardly ever stop to look at themselves while correctly blaming the system. It is comfortable, I suppose, to blame others and to blame nameless, faceless entities, much more so than the hell of realizing that the essence of the system stares right back at you from the mirror. Which is, I feel that this is really one of the profound contributions of Rastafari compared to most politics, which is really about winning an argument over an enemy and not about changing oneself. So the focus that the Rastafarians look at here is that how can we free ourselves from this whole logic? And then also Allende, and another leader figure here, says that suffering only continues for many because they view the world the same way as their oppressors do. Individuals can free themselves from this. So an interesting thing there is that I analyzed also is how the response of Rastafarians, especially the lion response, it is sometimes just to do the exact opposite. And I think this also gives some profound insights. And Ayana explains this by saying that sometimes one must lean completely to the left in order to rebalance the boat.
Yeah, she's reflective, and these people like her are at the level of the lamb, as you noted in your piece.
Yeah, and she recognizes then that this leaning completely to the left to rebalancing, this is what in post-colonial theory is talked about as strategic essentialism. So you can generally say that Black nationalism is a response because simply, if you look at the African-American struggle, like Malcolm X, for example, that it isn't enough. If you want equality and you want to rebalance, it isn't enough to simply say, let's do away with racism, because first the Blacks that have been assumed to be inferior have to be lifted up so that you rebalance. And sometimes that is being done through Black power, Black supremacy, Black nationalism, which kind of is as if it is a mirror image of the white dominance. So there is a justification there as a strategic step towards this stage of the lamp where it's all one love and unity and everyone comes together. So I think that's an interesting, it has some political implications. If we look at, for example, the culture wars in the US now and the discussion about the woke and awakened contrast, because I would say that in a sense, you can say that some of the expressions of the lion is what you would see in movements like Black Lives Matter, and also parallel, like the Me Too movement, the women's movement. There are similar things there, and sometimes they go out very aggressive against what has been the dominant culture, which is like a strategic step before one comes to an awakened stage where everyone is empowered, and I find that quite interesting, which is also where I used the stage theories of consciousness development from humanistic psychology. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Wilber, who I use in this.
Yes, I looked at all the references, and I'm familiar with quite a bit of them. So you cited Hall from the German European writer.
Yeah. And his distinction between the authoritarian and humanitarian religion, I think that's also like the Rastafarians fit very well into, I think, the humanitarian religion where they criticize the authoritarianism, which is, I found that many of the typical Rastafarian views were very similar to what the humanistic psychologist Eric Fromm says, which is also interesting, to see that.
But at the lower level, at the lower levels, people are more authoritarian. But when they evolve to the level of the lamb, they become humanistic. So Rastafarians who are more self-reflective, they would their ideology would correspond to the humanitarian level. But Professor, we have covered deep ground, and unfortunately, I have to wrap up. We have been speaking for about 30 minutes, and the show is for around 40 minutes. But speaking to you has been a pleasure, and your paper is really innovative. Thanks again for showing up.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me again, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
All right, bye, Christian.
Bye.